Okay, we're going to look at the abolition of man. Forgive me for not getting through the entirety of Paralandra. I don't need to do plot summary for you. You can read the story yourself. My aim was to do what I did, which is to try and trace the general thrust of why Lewis was doing what he was doing, and also to demonstrate how he achieved it through literary devices, and use the plot line of modern science fiction to speak back against not just the science fiction, but of a whole way of looking at the world, which he labeled evolutionary as opposed to devolutionary. And as I say, he addressed that or used those terms explicitly in the work called The Discarded Image in the epilogue, so right at the end. He talked about that. And my contention has been that his fiction is aiming to reinstitute a sense of a devolutionary universe. And with it, a sense of a spiritual reality, which the reductionist ideologies of the last several hundred years have slowly led us to lose a sense. So a sense of sanctity in anything. A growing sense of, the old-fashioned world will be secularism, in the sense of it's just this age, for the just now. So a growing secularism. But there's more to it than that, because if secular would, in the old view, just also be connected to a sense of the heavenly. There could be the secular, just true of this age, but there could also be the sacred, which would be a realm that would be true not just for this age, but the age beyond. Modern senses of secularism, as he's addressing it, break ranks with the sacred altogether by denying the sacred even in the secular. And that's what the abolition of man is about. It's about how modern education gets rid of what he calls the Tao, T-A-O. It's a term he invents here. He's not talking about the Eastern religion or that perspective which we call Taoism. It is a term that he uses to describe, and he presents it in various forms, such as in the beginning of Mere Christianity, the law of human nature or natural law. It has various ways of describing it, but it's ascribing that there are certain rules or laws of human nature which are as real and have been acknowledged as sufficiently and adequately, if not more so, than what we now call the laws of the natural world. So the humanities had their own law, objectively verified, and he, in the first two chapters of The Abolition of Man, well, actually in the second, he catalogs how this is so by looking at various religious perspectives. He looks at Islam, he looks at Judaism, he looks at Christianity, and he looks at Eastern religions, for that matter, including Hinduism, sort of moral codes that all humanity seems to have recognized, and so strongly so that it's enforced them, said, no, this is how the society is going to be operated, because they saw it as what we today call objective morality. That's our phrase. It's a funny term, actually. But all we're doing when we say objective morality is trying to use the language of science to reinforce that we believe that there is a nature to human nature which doesn't change. So an unchanging human nature. And the reason why that phrase comes into force and why it's being pushed as such is because the acids of modernity are trying to disintegrate that sense that human nature has a nature. And those are expressed in terms of the way in which the human sciences turn on humanity itself. And it occurs to me I should throw up this famous passage in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University when Lewis was installed as, there we go, was installed as the chair of Renaissance and medieval and Renaissance literature. It was created for him. For years he tried to get promoted at Oxford. There was resistance in-house. He was not given this distinction. Cambridge plucked him from Oxford, so poached him by offering him this chair in the two areas of literature which they regarded him to have expertise in, the two periods that we call the medieval and the Renaissance, which were seen as totally different, discrete areas, nothing to do with one another. And so there was a certain perspective, even in the teaching of literature, which we've held on to this day, that the medieval period was the so-called Dark Ages and the Renaissance was something like an extension of the Enlightenment, or a movement away from religion towards secularism. And Lewis simply observes throughout his writing that the Renaissance is really an extension of the medieval period. It's not really that different. It's not that there are no differences, but there is a common worldview, to use our language. And he reinforced that through the discarded image, those what were once public lectures, and then got written down in that collection. I discussed it last semester in the C.S. Lewis class. I'm not going to do that here. But he went through a whole long list of common ground, common viewpoints that really there was no distinction between the medieval and Renaissance periods, really. And the Renaissance, after all, is just the revival of classical learning, and the medieval was built and out of the classical period. So it's not really a departure from the medieval. It's, in a sense, a return to the sources to try and be more what they already are. And that literary and humanities-based movement then led to the Reformation, because it's the text that Erasmus created of a Greek text, a reliable Greek text, that actually was foundational to the Reformers' translation of that text into English then. It was interesting to return to sources and look at what do the documents actually say as to what our practices are, that led to, again, a similar spirit of let's get to the substance of the matter. And I think the same thing happens in the scientific revolution in the late 17th century. Okay, modern science said that this was the way it is. Let's look at how it really is. And really that it's not a departure then from the medieval period in that sense. It's just trying to continue the project of the university. Remember, the university is a medieval Christian institution. It's the great Christian institution, the university. Lewis is writing from his university, but these lectures, The Abolition of Man, they get written up as The Abolition of Man, were given at the University of Durham in 1943, my alma mater, but actually up in Newcastle, which there was an extension campus up there at the time. And it was it was the Riddle Memorial Lectures, 3 parts. I'm not going to deal with the first 2 because I deal with them elsewhere. I've already lectured on them multiple times. They're up on YouTube. But also the third one is the one that's most pertinent to the sci-fi trilogy and what specifically we're going to see in That Hideous Strength. So we're taking a sort of interlude between the first 2 novels and the third just for one class, because I think what he writes here we're going to see directly borne out in what he does in That Hideous Strength, which is after the first 2 novels you expect something similar in the third, and it goes all crazy in a totally different direction in a way that some people find fascinating, other people just don't like at all. Tolkien hated it. To each his own, I guess. But very different influence, and he's doing something very different with it. I'll say more about that next time. But he is focusing on what happens to human nature, and so this is why I brought this up. Because this is called, the lecture is called De Descriptione Temporum, on the categorization of the ages. So medieval, Renaissance, whatever, like how do we determine those things? Because his own chair is going to bring two things that were once seen to be totally separated, and the Renaissance scholars deal with one thing, medievalists deal with others, and never the twain shall meet. There's no overlap. He is able to do that, and his argument is it's not something that I should be able to do. The academy should do this as well. But he takes it bigger than that. It's bigger than combining the medieval Renaissance. He wants to deal with how do we categorize altogether? Where is the real dividing line? And the dividing line is right in the middle of the period we're discussing. Frankenstein, mid-19th century, science fiction, that's where it is for Lewis. And I'll just read this out to you. Between Jane Austen and us, when he says us, it's 1943. Jane Austen's writing 1820s, thereabouts. Between her and us, not between her and Shakespeare, Chaucer, Alfred, Virgil, Homer, or the Pharaohs, comes the birth of the machines. This lifts us at once into a region of change far above what we have hitherto considered. For this is parallel to the great changes by which we divide epochs of prehistory. This is on a level with the change from stone to bronze, or from a pastoral to an agricultural economy. It alters man's place in nature. That's why. The theme has been celebrated till we're sick of it, so I'll say nothing about the economic and social consequences, though measurable though they are. What concerns us is the psychological effect. How has it come about that we use the highly emotive term stagnation, with all its malodorous and malarial overtones, for what other ages would have called permanence? So if there's no change, we talk about economic stagnation. There's no, like, the economy didn't grow. It's stagnant. The world is the same this year as it was last year. Good. No, this is bad. If it doesn't move forward, it's rotting. It's not making progress. How do we come to these associations? This is what he's getting at. When our ancestors talked of the primitive church or the primitive purity of our Constitution, they meant nothing of that sort. And why are the latest always the best? Well, he talks about a 19th century belief in spontaneous progress, which owes itself something to either Darwin's theorem of biological evolution or that myth of universal evolutionism, which is really so different from it and earlier. And let's skip over that because I've already talked about that. The fact that Darwin's theory of evolution is preceded by myths of evolution by 100 years. So it's a pre-scientific theory which then gets put into practice as if it were a scientific hypothesis, but it's not. It's an Enlightenment legacy. The idea that things begin from the low and move upwards, progress. That's what he's talking about. But what is the real difference here? Well, it is that, and it's not in, I thought it was in this section, it's where we decide to move from conquering nature, which characterizes science from the late 17th century all the way up through the 18th century, making nature more productive, exercising the dominion mandate, if you will, making crops more abundant, making livestock more fertile, greater milk yield, production, and so forth, rationalizing processes so that more people are fed on the same thing. So making it more productive, again, dominion mandate. That's applied to the world outside of humanity. Come the mid-19th century, it gets applied to human nature. That's where he sees the big shift. And this is what the abolition of man is about. It's the conquest of nature, but not now the natural world outside of us, but rather human nature. And he sees this in the educational establishment as its standard operating procedure. This is what they're trying to do in what we call education. That's what the first chapter is about. He picks up a school text and says, here's what they're saying. as I say, I'm not going to recapitulate it because I just can't take the time to do that here. But I'm going to read this is from Leon Trotsky. Do you know who Leon Trotsky is? A compatriot with Lenin. Do you know who Lenin is? After he's a Marxist, right? Marxist Leninism, Trotsky. Trotsky writes this, 1924. The human species, the coagulated Homo sapiens, will once more enter into a state of radical transformation, and in his own hand will become an object of the most complicated methods of artificial selection and psychophysical training. It is difficult to predict the extent of self-government which the man of the future may reach, or the heights to which he may carry his technique. Social construction and psychophysical self-education will become two aspects of one and the same process. Man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic. The average human type will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx, and above this ridge, new peaks will rise. This sounds noble. We're going to make people, every man's going to be a Shakespeare, or a Goethe, or a Marx. This is what the future is going to look like. And why? Because we're going to take total control over human nature. Not just physically, but psychologically. We will determine it, and it will be socialized, but also internalized. There will be a total harmony in processes. There will be no dissent. There will be no individuality on this. We'll all push in the same direction. It will be the same vision which is used by the psychologist B.F. Skinner in classical conditioning. I don't know if is anyone here a psychologist studying psychology? B.F. Skinner is into conditioning, and with that, treating human beings as if they were animals. All the things that you can do to reward behavior and so forth. You can do little things, carrots and sticks, basically. Little punishments, little incentives, and you can make people do what you want. And so that's what's called conditioning. Lewis says that conditioning process is the whole aim of the educational establishment right now. It's not the traditional aim of educators. The traditional aim of educators is to make the children be adults like them. They're to follow their example. The modern educator wants to condition the children as patients, inflicting on them a view that they themselves may not even hold. It's to make something of them, just like Frankenstein's creature. That's why I started with Frankenstein. There's something of the taking of human nature as if it was something material and moldable, and if you just, people might be normally 6 feet tall if they're tall. Well, we'll make them 8 feet tall, and we'll make them stronger and smarter. We'll make, the Frankenstein creature will be like a little Shakespeare in a 8-foot body. Terrific, superhuman. Bigger, stronger, faster. Yes?
So what would Lewis's commentary be in terms of saying, if we used to think of children as growing into adults, and that was them taking on our image, similar to how we take on God's image, what image are they following?
It's a very good question. So if the children are not following our image and we following God's image, which is what the pedagogy of the ancient world was, particularly when Christians took over classical learning and said, well, actually, we're not just wanting them to be like us, we are trying to be like the human being, Jesus Christ. We're following his example. What would they be then? That's exactly the question that he has as well. So he starts with this phrase, man's conquest of nature, which he sees his contemporaries use all the time. He does what Lewis usually does, which is he uses a hook, a little a little story which pulls you into a way of thinking, and then he takes you on the roller coaster ride, which his lectures and his chapters usually give us. So, it's often used to describe progress of applied science, the conquest of nature. Man has nature whacked, said someone to a friend of mine not long ago. In their context, the words had a certain tragic beauty, for the speaker was dying of tuberculosis. No matter, he said, I know I'm one of the casualties. Of course, there are casualties on the winning as well as on the losing side, but that doesn't alter the fact that it is winning. But here's the question. It's at the last line of his paragraph, and he does this repeatedly. Just note for yourself in terms of writing style, consider this. You go through a certain train of logical argument, and then you conclude it with a question. The next paragraph then answers the question, so they link. And it, right, completes the thought. In what sense is man the possessor of increasing power over nature? Well, he'll look at it in three ways. Let's consider three examples. Airplane, wireless, contraceptive. Wireless is just like a telegraph. Let's take it as a cell phone. Same thing. It's a phone. It's a means of communication across great distances. And the third is a contraceptive. The pill, a condom, whatever you want. Some means of birth control. In a civilized community in peacetime, anyone who can pay for them may use these things. But it cannot strictly be said that when he does so, he is exercising his own proper or individual power over nature. If I pay you to carry me, I'm not therefore myself a strong man. Any or all of the three things I mentioned can be withheld from some men by other men. You're not allowed to fly in the plane. You're not allowed to have a cell phone. You can't use birth control. That can be withheld from people as well as given to them. So what we call man's power is in reality a power possessed by some men which they may or may not allow other men to profit by. Well, how about the three instances that he calls? Well, with the respect to the first two, the airplane and the wireless, we're as much a patient or a subject as the possessor, because we're the targets of bombs dropped from planes. 1943, London's just been blitzed. Or for propaganda, like the wireless is the means of communicating news. So sometimes we get the truth and sometimes we get fake news. We get propaganda as well. So then we suffer from the process. We don't get built up by it. So it can be used positively and negatively. The third one he finds even more interesting, the contraceptive, and I think it is more interesting. He says there is a paradoxical negative sense which all possible future generations are the patients or the subjects of a power wielded by those already alive. So it's not only a power to prevent something, as in an unintended pregnancy. It also prevents your whole posterity from coming into existence at all. It's extraordinary power. People don't think of it that way. It's like, I don't want to live with the consequences of this act. I want to do the act, but I don't want the consequences of it. Use contraception. He says, actually, there's a power dynamic here at work that goes beyond control of emissions. Right? There's more at hand here. And what is at hand is they are denied existence in the process. Okay? By contraception used as a means of selective breeding. So, today you can have the scan. If you're in the situation, I've had children, they now show you a little baby in your room and think, oh, isn't that cute? Everyone likes to see that. What's the purpose of it? Well, to see if there's something wrong with the child is the reason. And if there is, then the pressure to abort is extremely strong. They really push hard. So that's what it is. It's not, occasionally it's used, well, we can operate, we can do that, and okay, sometimes good, but the pressure to abort is extraordinary, so it is eugenics then, which leads to abortion. And is connected to fertility, which is why the Canaanite gods have re-emerged, the sex gods and also Moloch worship and so forth. They're all interconnected. But they are, without their concurring voice, made to be what one generation, for its own reasons, may choose to prefer. So we call it pro-choice. But the choice here denies choice, not just to somebody around us, but to future generations. So the choice is a rather extraordinary one that denies all manner of other choices. So this is not to weigh into a political debate. He's just noting a consequence that we don't usually think about. So, but from this point of view, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. So there you go. Nature is seen as in an instrumental fashion to gain power. Over whom? Not ourselves, not over nature, but actually over other men. He is going to talk about this because in That Hideous Strength, which is about a modern research university in which it's cooperating with a corporate entity, the corporate world, with the acronym the NICE, the NICE, National Institute Controlled Experimentation. They are going to do exactly this sort of thing. They're going to experiment on people, and they are going to gain power over nature and believe that they have nature whipped. And there is a different coalition of groups involved in this, by the way. There is the scientist there who's pursuing it for his own purposes. There is the industrialist or the businessman who's there. It's divine, by the way. He's now been promoted to lordship. He's Lord Feverstone, in case you didn't realize who this guy was. It's actually divine. He comes back. He wasn't in the other one. He emerges. He's a loathsome character. Then there are other people that are on board for sadistic reasons. So there's a lady there who's motivated by sadism. She likes seeing people suffer. All of them are motivated by gaining power over nature. They sense there's a power over motivation behind all of them, and thereby they feel empowered, but their power is coming at the expense of others. And what Lewis does in the third novel is show what he already has illustrated in the second novel, that this is motivated by demons. Demons lie behind this attempt to gain power over nature and deceive even the people who think they're on their side, because the demons have no sides. They're actually against everybody, including the people who are doing their bidding. Comment or question?
I know that we highlighted that the division to C.S. Lewis started with, like at the moment Frankenstein was published. What was the Frankenstein being a story? What was the event in the world that he would have coined as that separation? Was it the eugenics movement?
I don't think the eugenics movement proper had begun, although I can't remember when Mendele, the biologist, noted what we now call genetics and using it with flowers, where you would mix the red and the white carnations and you would get different shades and so forth. I can't remember what time period that was. And I don't think Frankenstein specifically, explicitly talks about eugenics, but it is effectively an act of, he's more interested in just the possibility of creating life and the problems with that. But she is not explicitly addressing what will come from this a generation later, which is the idea of breeding, selective breeding. This is just creating life altogether from non-material or material matter without life. We'll inject life into it. And the problems that ensue from that will to be a creator and gain power over human nature. So it's in the same ballpark, but it's not yet moved into eugenics. I think eugenics comes out of Darwin. Because remember, Darwin's theory is of natural selection and survival of the fittest will arise out of that as well. And so there's a sense that, yes, evolution comes, things come from lower and they get more progressively higher, but how do they do that? What's the mechanism? Well, the fittest survive and the less fit don't. Well, once you have that, then you have the rationale for eugenics. Let's make the in order for progress to happen, let's manage the process so that the best. So we'll work with evolution, basically. We'll get rid of the less fit, and we'll encourage the breeding of the more fit. In fact, we'll put them together, for that matter. We'll make sure that people with good genes in this area and this area, we'll put them together. They don't like each other. That doesn't matter. Then we'll just artificially inseminate. We'll just do what we do with bulls, and there you go, done. And we'll get a better stock of human beings out of it. That's the eugenics movement. And we won't allow these people to breed, so they actually will sterilize as part of the same movement. And again, it's, never mind the specific instances there, the general trajectory is what he's talking about. Never mind your repugnance over a particular act, which sometimes is done by bad men, sometimes is done by good men. He's not interested in getting into that, although I'm sure he has strong views on it. He wants to look at the whole, the big picture here. What is really going on? Well, the real going on, he says, the thing that we call man's power over nature must essentially be, and even if we take away the exploitation by individuals of the process and we nationalize everything, or even globalize it, like we are talking about right now. We globalize what will happen. Well, even with a world state, this will mean the power of one nation over others. Which is the state with the technology? Which is the state with the money? That's the one that's going to dominate the global state. It'll just get the others to cooperate with it, yes, and it will do so by offering incentives to cooperative states and so forth. But it will game the system, so the banking system and the tech system and the travel and so forth is all centrally controlled for the benefit of one particular nation and for a particular class of people within that particular nation. That's where he's going with this. But he will say, even within that, it will mean in principle the power of majorities over minorities, and in the concrete of a government over the people. There you go. And all long-term exercises of power, especially in breeding, must mean the power of earlier generations over later ones. So the decisions that we make in what we call reproductive or health care are not just about the individuals who happen to get pregnant. It affects the future. He's also going to push that and say, actually, because of the way in which they view human nature, it also involves the rejection of the past. So it's this generation acting for its selfish motives, not thinking about the common human nature that it shared with the past, the wisdom of the ancients, the virtues that have been acknowledged in every religion, but doing it for this generation, gaining power over ourselves, and thereby ignoring the consequences for the future. Actually, there won't be a future. If you're not allowing breeding, then people are not going to propagate themselves. It'll defy the dominion mandate to be fruitful and multiply. So there's something blasphemous about it. You're deliberately saying, I'm going to will to be good what God has said is not good. It's not good for man to be alone. It's not good for one generation to be alone. I would extend it. They should be connected with the vulnerable, the weak, their offspring. Anyway, but so there's his point. Now this latter point, he says, is not always sufficiently emphasized because those who write on social matters have not yet learned to imitate the physicists by including time among the dimensions. This is very important. We don't think about long-term consequences. That's because elections are won on a short cycle of like 4 years or thereabouts. You want to win the election. How about the downstream consequences of these decisions, economically, politically? Nowadays, they're talking about a demographic winter. What does that mean? It means there's not enough population there to sustain the older generation. There's not enough young people coming through into the job market to pay into the pension plans to keep the old people alive and fit, because they paid enough into it, but they didn't think they were going to live to be 90, 100 years old. They thought they were going to live to be 70. That's how the pension plan was set up. 70 years and 10 are your years. They got right out of Scripture. 70. You retire at 65, you got 5 years of pension plan. That's what you got paid for. Very carefully man, what happens if you live to 80? Well, then you're outliving your allotted pension. Are they going to cut them off? Well, they're voters. They're not going to cut them off. But they're going to cut back on it and make it very difficult for them to live. Still, you see the problem here. And this is all trying to manage the present and make the present moment gain power over themselves at the expense of the future and at the expense of the past, as it happens to be. Because we're going to manage everything. Everything's going to be planned. But time is not considered among the dimensions. He notes, and he's right here. In order to fully understand what man's power over nature and therefore the power of some men over other men really means, we must picture the race extended in time from the date of its emergence to that of its extinction. Now the key phrase. Each generation exercises power over its successors. And each, insofar as it modifies the environment bequeathed to it and rebels against tradition, resists and limits the power of its predecessors. So not only is it a rebellion against the future generations such that it denies them existence, it is a rebellion against your parents. It's regarding yourself as an orphan. You have no forebears, and you're not thinking about anybody outside yourself. So remember I said to you that the model of hero in the Romantic period, which emerges and has never gone away, is to consider yourself like an orphan. Do it for yourself. Ignore your parents. Ignore your church. Ignore your culture. Do it for yourself. Do what feels right. Do what you think is best. You be you. This modifies the picture, which is sometimes painted, of a progressive emancipation from tradition and a progressive control of natural processes, resulting in a continual increase of human power. Because everybody thinks that we're getting more and more powerful. Why? Because we have a device that can allow us to communicate on the other side of the globe instantly. This camera, which I'm going to upload this and it'll go on YouTube and it's watched all over the world. I mean, I'm not saying everybody's watching it. I'm saying I get people writing me from Africa, from India, from South America, all over the place. It's extraordinary. It's pretty cool. Extraordinary power. Yes. Gets rid of what? Distance. What else will it do? It'll get rid of time if it stays. I mean, theoretically, it can stay in perpetuity. There, if somebody doesn't take it down, which they will soon. But not right now, not quite yet. It's a terrific, and you can do it simultaneously, as you know. FaceTime or Zoom or whatever. So it's a power to eliminate distance and time. There in the time zone, people are still like whatever I'm at this time here, it's 12 hours ahead in Sydney. And so we've eliminated time, the time difference to some degree, at least artificially in this way. So this is a power which has never been seen. And with that, we tend to think that it's all gain. It's all gain and there is no loss. Lewis is talking about the loss. In reality, of course, what any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They're diminished. They have less freedom because they've been determined by their forebears. And their forebears didn't want them to be like themselves. They wanted to, it was self-aggrandizement. That was their motive. Their motive was not to do what's best for the kids. It was to do what was best for themselves, and to heck with the kids. The kids will worry about the problem after we've cracked the eggs. And the result is they are weaker, not stronger. So he's questioning. This is another way of questioning evolution. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And if, as is almost certain, the age which has thus attained maximum power over posterity were also the age most emancipated from tradition, it would be engaged in reducing the power of its predecessors almost as drastically as that of its successors. So what would you expect in the education system? I would expect them to throw out all books and no longer let you read Shakespeare or the Bible or any religious text You would have to read contemporary authors only. You'd have to push the political and social agendas of your contemporaries and the leaders in that movement. That's what they would demand of you. That would never happen, fortunately, to us. Blank stares. Okay. And the last men, far from being the heirs of power, will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the great planners and conditioners, and will themselves exercise least power upon the future, because they will have been totally conditioned by their predecessors, even to the point of eugenics. We're not going to permit these. B.F. Skinner adopts this as his agenda. It's a work called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, by the way. I mentioned it last semester. And he says that C.S. Lewis is the foremost defender of the literatures of freedom and dignity. And he goes after Lewis. He says, yes, I want to get rid of the old human ideal. I don't like this idea of a common human nature, which we all inherit and we're to measure up to. I want to make the future better. And the only way we're going to do that is to get rid of people's freedoms. And we're going to have to get beyond the idea of human dignity, because human dignity will prevent us from experimenting on people in ways that we think are necessary to make things better. You're going to have to get rid of, in other words, you're going to have to get rid of the Nuremberg Code on experimentation. You know what the Nuremberg Code is? Informed consent. No, that's the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no wrong. They've already got rid of that. They took that out of the Hippocratic Oath. Doctors no longer swear to first do no harm. They took that little phrase out. So they're willing to do harm in the name of healthcare. So is healthcare if you can do harm in the process? I would say that it includes evil in the definition of good then, and you've collapsed the idea of what you're doing in the medical system if you do that. That's a bigger topic. The Nuremberg Code is the doctrine of informed consent. It was used in universities, in hospitals, whatever. You have to tell the patient before they undertake a treatment of all the possible consequences that might ensue if you undergo this treatment, and to sign and agree to that. It's on every pill bottle that you have. Here are the consequences, and you're supposed to read them. Of course, it's so fine print, so small, and now you have to fold it out and read it for 2 hours, and you're like, I have a headache, just give me the pill. You have to read all that, but that's the idea, that you have to be informed, you have to know of all the possible consequences, and if you agree to it, okay. Because you have dignity and you're a person, so we require your consent as an adult. You can't get this from children. They have to be considered mature enough to consent. They have to understand consequences. You can't do this to small children. This is my argument against the contemporary sex ed curriculum. You're asking them to submit and agree to things that they can't possibly understand. They have not achieved the age of majority. Like if they accidentally hit somebody with a bat and they killed them, would you put them in prison like an adult? No, you wouldn't. If they're 6 years old and they whack somebody, even intentionally, you wouldn't put them in prison. Why? Because they're not yet mature, even though they killed somebody still. So why would you do this then in other areas? Because it's the same argument. And the answer to my question is that the conditioners are conditioning in a way that they want to condition the kids. For whatever ends, that's another question. He'll get to that. What is the end of this violation of human nature? And I'm not even talking about the sexual ethics of it all. I'm just talking about the fact that this is a child and these are adults. And that there's a family responsibility of parents over children that's being breached here. What justifies that informed consent, which the parents used to have to give for their kids to get medical treatments? What happened to that? So the real picture is of one dominant age, and let's say it's the year 10,000, 100th century AD. throws it into the far future, which resists all previous ages most successfully and dominates all subsequent ages most irresistibly, and thus is the real master of the human species. So note what he is doing here. He's showing a generation that builds itself up like a tower, so that what came before it is like a level plane, and what comes after it is a level plane. So it's just literally a tower, the Tower of Babel. That is exactly what he's going to talk about in That Hideous Strength. It's a modern Tower of Babel that the conditioners are creating for themselves. And we all know what the biblical associations are with the Tower of Babel and what God does to it. Remember that when you read it. But then that's the purpose of me looking at this here, is to fit it in with the novel. Within this master generation, itself an infinitesimal minority of the species, the power will be exercised by a minority smaller still. Man's conquest of nature, if the dream of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he's also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. So what he's saying is, this is not a one-sided victory lap of humanity over itself. There's a loss here, and the loss is extraordinary. How are we even going to calculate it? He's not even there yet. I'm not even considering whether the result is good or bad. I'm only making clear that man's conquest of nature really means, and especially the final stage, which is perhaps not that far off. What is the final stage? When by eugenics, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, by an education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, B.F. Skinner, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will then be won. We shall have taken the thread of life out of the hands of Clotho, one of the fates who extends human life. There are three. One pulls it, one cuts it, right? There's a whole process there. That thread of life is taken out of the hands of it, and we henceforth be free to make our species whatever we wish it to be. The battle indeed will be won, but who will have won it? There's the question. If you've conquered human nature, who's the one that's doing the conquering now? You're conquering yourself. What's left? For the power of man to make himself what he pleases means, as we've seen, the power of some men to make other men what they please. In all ages, no doubt, nurture and instruction have in some sense attempted to exercise this power, but the situation to which we must look forward to will be novel in two respects. Firstly, the power will be enormously increased. The educators will have much more power over the students than they did in the past. Plato had dreams about this. He mentions Eliot, he mentions Locke. They had plans to make education better. They had no capacity to realize that. They just lacked the ability to enforce their schemes of education. The desire was there, even in Plato. But they lacked, what did they lack? Man-rulers of the New Age will be armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and irresistible scientific technique. So they didn't have the tools or the use of technology to be able to get everywhere through your smartphone, to track you, not just watch this, but you can be watched through it, right? So propaganda can come through it. What constitutes truth and news can be filtered through it. The state can intervene so that you see what they want you to see and don't see what they don't want you to see, etc. Second difference is even more important. And this is the fundamental difference. It's not just the extension of power in the hands of an elite, although that's a big one that everyone can see. In the older systems, both the kind of man the teachers wished to produce and their motives for producing them were prescribed by the Tao, the law of human nature. A norm to which the teachers themselves were subject and from which they claimed no liberty to depart. I have no authority to treat a human being as anything less than human. Guess what? The doctrine of slavery is an acknowledgement of a dehumanizing practice, which implicitly acknowledges that there is a human practice. They're just not following it in this particular case. So we're going to allow us to enslave these people. That's an abject state. Do you want to be a slave? No, you absolutely do not. Yes, but what you've acknowledged then is human nature, left to its own devices, doesn't want to be a slave. Yes, so there is a common human nature being acknowledged there. So they will do it in a specific case, but still the law of human nature is being acknowledged. They did not cut men to some pattern they had chosen. They handed on what they'd received. They initiated the young neophyte into the mystery of humanity, which overarched him and them alike. It was but the old birds teaching young birds to fly. It was training in wisdom and virtue. That's what it was. This phrase, not cutting men into some pattern they'd chosen, is rather appropriate in a day of surgeries and injections and literally cutting into patterns. I've seen people who are faces in the form of dragons and so forth, and surgeries to cut that, allegedly for the purposes of the person who demands it, and for their good, for that matter. That's the way it used to be. Old birds teaching young birds to fly. This will be changed. Values are now mere natural phenomena. Judgments of value are to be produced in the pupil as part of the conditioning. So it's not values that have been passed on which have ever been acknowledged as virtues in every religion, in every culture, which he calls the Tao. Values are now something that the conditioners themselves create in departure from the Tao. There's the standard. They depart from the Tao. That's the new value. Whatever Tao there is left will be the product, not the motive of education. The part of nature which they have conquered. Just one more. The ultimate springs of human action are no longer for them something given. They have surrendered like electricity. It is the function of the conditioners to control, not to obey those laws. They know how to produce conscience and decide what kind of conscience they will produce. In other words, what you will be able to say and what you won't be able to say. What you will be able to call good or just or true. You'll still want to appeal to goodness, justice, and truth. Well, we'll just redefine them. And create a conscience that will hold to the new laws that have nothing to do with the law of human nature, but rather with the laws that the authorities want to promote. They themselves are outside above. I do notice that I don't see many tech men doing genital reassignment surgery on themselves. I just don't see much of it, nor their children. They don't want it to be so. They're not imposing it on themselves or their families. They're just not. They're letting other people do it, and they're getting a lot of money out of it. So is the pharmaceutical industry, the med tech industry. It's a lot of money to be made in helping people like this. For we are assuming the last stage of man's struggle with nature, the final victory has been won, human nature has been conquered, and of course has conquered in whatever sense those words may now bear. So this is really interesting. The conditioners then, those that are in charge of this whole process, are to choose what kind of artificial Tao, artificial law, they will, for their own good reasons, produce in the human race. They are the motivators, the creators of motives. They're not motivated by the laws that the Creator has put into his creation, which even the pagans acknowledged. Right? That's what Romans 1. It talks about them knowing what's right and wrong because God has made it plain to them in the way things have been created. This is a different type of problem that never existed in the ancient world at all. How are they going to be motivated? Okay, so they're the motivators, the creative modes. How are they going to be motivated themselves? If they're the motivators, what's their motive? And what is going to motivate them? Note how he concludes the paragraph with a question and then moves on to the answer of the question and then asks another question. Well, for a time perhaps, by survivals within their minds of the old natural Tao. The Tao will linger on for a while in the public education system. It's going to stay there. Like when you've got a tank full of gas and now you're got down to the bottom of it, now you're going on fumes. You got about a mile left and then it's going to stop after you've exhausted all the old fumes of the Tao. Well, why? Because you had a little bit of that. So each successive generation of educated, conditioned people moves further away from the Tao. That's what he's warning about here, by the way. Thus, at first, they may look upon themselves as servants and guardians of humanity and conceive that they have a duty to do it good. So they might appeal to those old standards. But it is only by confusion that they can remain in this state. They recognize the concept of duty as the result of certain processes which they can now control. Their victory has consisted precisely in emerging from the state in which they are acted upon by those processes to the state in which they use them as tools. So duty is now just a word that you give to other people to follow, but you yourself don't follow it because you're emancipated from the Tao. You might use it, but now you only use it to get other people to do what you want to do. You can appeal to justice, social justice, whatever. What does social justice have to do with justice? Let's not deal with that question. Because after all, one of the things they now have to decide is whether they will or will not so condition the rest of us that we can go on having the old idea of duty and the old reactions to it. How can duty help them to decide that? Duty is itself up for trial. Should we even appeal to that as a motive? Because we've already said that that's not the motivation for our actions. And good, appeal to the good, that fares no better. They know quite well how to produce a dozen different conceptions of good in us. The question is, which, if any, they should produce. No conception of good can help them to decide. They've no longer regarded as something that has any purchase over their decisions. We don't need to say, well, what's the good thing to do? Well, what is the good? That's part of what they've set aside. It is absurd to fix on one of the things they are comparing and make it the standard of comparison. Now, he raises a hypothetical, but by this point, I think there's a little bit of horror that sets into his audience, maybe you as well. Like, well, oh, this is not good. So, it sounds like he is going after a certain type of people and that these are bad people that are doing this. And I think that's true that they are, but that's not his point. Because even the term bad doesn't have any meaning here, and they don't recognize the badness and the goodness in the whole thing. That's not a consideration for them. So this is what is going to motivate people, and he's going to show this in That Hideous Strength, is people who seem oblivious to matters of conscience to good and evil because they've got rid of not only the good but also the evil in motivations. Yes. Yes. Yeah. There's all sorts of instances of this. And this is the problem. They're not bad men. He says that, well, I'm not supposing them to be bad men. They're not men in the old sense at all. They are, if you like, men who've sacrificed their own share in traditional humanity in order to devote themselves to the task of deciding what humanity shall henceforth mean. Because humanity is something that they no longer partake in, because they're the conditioners and those are the conditioned. They, in other words, they don't see themselves as the same part of the human race. And they will, and he suggests that they will actually probably have contempt for the herd, of which they no longer belong. He doesn't think that it necessarily will be so, but he suspects it will be so. So then what will motivate them? But he goes on to say, and he repeats what he said, they are not men at all, stepping outside the Tao, that is the law of human nature, which they shared with everyone else. They have stepped into the void. Now he's going to depict this in That Hideous Strength, explicitly. Nor are their subjects necessarily unhappy men. They might be very happy. Think of Brave New World. There's an elite, and they condition prenatal, the alphas, the betas, the gammas, the deltas, the epsilons, whatever, and they give them soma so that they have drugs, and they're happy, and they allow them to have sex with whoever they want to. No moral inhibitions. They're delighted. They're like pigs in the mud. Everyone's happy, happy, happy. All the time. It doesn't mean that they're going to be unhappy, but they will be controlled. Totally controlled. Aldous Huxley sees things differently than Orwell. Orwell thinks it'll come down like with a lead jackboot on the human face forever, right? It's going to be brutal and against people's wills, and they'll be forcibly done it against their will. Huxley says, no, they're gonna love it. They're gonna give up their humanity for the pleasure of it all. Yet the conditioners will act. When I have said that just now that all motives fail them, I should have said all motives except one. All motives that claim any validity other than that of their felt emotional weight at a given moment have failed them. Everything except the sic volo, sic jubeo, has been explained away. What does this mean? Sic volo, sic jubeo stat pro ratione voluntas. So, thus I will, thus I command, my pleasure stands for law. The law is whatever pleases me. Think of the Caesars. Think of the horrific beings of human history like Caligula or Nero. Like whatever I feel like right now. Total arbitrary, capricious will in the moment. I liked you today, you're gone tomorrow. Right now, whatever motive comes into my head. But what never claimed objectivity cannot be destroyed by subjectivism. When all that says it is good has been debunked, then what I want remains. So it's pure voluntarism, unrestrained by notions of good or evil. Not just good, but evil. It just what I want. The word evil means nothing. By the way, he will associate this in Book 2 of Mere Christianity, Chapter 1, Alternative Religious Views, with pantheism. Good and evil are just a matter of perspective, but they're not real things. This is the product of pantheism as well, which itself comes in the Romantic movement. I just lectured on that this morning. My point is that those who stand outside all judgments of value cannot have any ground for preferring one of their own impulses to another except the emotional strength of that impulse. They're not going to appeal to the Tao. They're going to get to the point where it's just purely arbitrary power, desire at that moment. They're going to be totally driven by their passions. What does Scripture say about those driven by their passions? It says not to be like them. In the book of James. It's like a man who's looked into a mirror and seen his face and then forgets what he sees. You can be driven by your passions, desires. Are you on board with the abolition of man, gaining power over it through technology? Do you think you're gaining something in the process, or are you actually giving yourself over to demonic desires and unwittingly cooperating with something that is not only against your own best interest, but the interests of everyone else around you? What Lewis says here, interestingly, he says, I am not, oops, if I find this, I'm very doubtful whether history shows us one example of a man who, having stepped outside traditional morality and gained power, has used that power benevolently. No man who thinks that standards that apply to everyone else and don't apply to him is a good man. There is no such thing. This is a mythological creature. So somebody who's so shameless that when they're caught in the public doing things that are regarded as horrid, and won't then say, okay, I'm not fit for this role that I'm in, should be trusted to do anything but bad things. They will not exercise their power benevolently. So it used to be that politicians, when they're caught in the acts of scandal, adultery, whatever, they would resign. That was an age where the Tao was acknowledged. Do politicians resign now when they do bad things? When they absolutely do not. Some of them don't even apologize. They just say that they're learning or something like that. I'm on a learning process. I'm on a journey, okay. But if the reason they would resign is they're saying there is a law, I've broken it, I've fallen on this side, and I'm going to, my own soul is worth more than the power that I'm holding on to. I'm going to step back. I've done a bad thing, and maybe that person who's done a bad thing can be corrected in the process. And that is up to the populace as a whole, I would say, to hold that person to account and insist that they resign then for their own sake as much as their own. So what happens then in our democracies when political leaders, sports figures, whatever, do things that are beyond the pale and continue on doing what they're doing? I think it corrupts them and all of us with it, because we don't hold them to a standard of Tao because we don't believe it ourselves anymore. Why don't we believe it? Because we've been educated to say that it actually doesn't hold true of human nature. I'm not even giving you a specific example because I don't want to appear like I'm making a political statement. I'm making an observation, just like Lewis is here. I am inclined to think that the conditioners will hate the conditioned, though regarding as an illusion the artificial conscience which they produce in us, their subjects, they will yet perceive that it creates in us an illusion of meaning for our lives, which compares favorably with the futility of their own. So they'll hate us because we hold on to our religion, which they regard as ridiculous, but they'll hate us because we believe there's a meaning in life and they don't have any meaning, so they'll despise us for it. Because we will effectively be looking down on them, they won't be able to tolerate that contempt. Even though it's not intended as contempt. There will be a hatred for Christians, in other words. All religious people will be despised by the conditioners. I think he's right. They will envy us as eunuchs envy men. You have a capacity that I don't have. The eunuch illustration he picked up in chapter 1 of the Abolition of Man, by the way. We want the function from them, and yet we take away the very thing that would make them to be fruitful and multiply. We bid the geldings be fruitful and multiply after having castrated them. When he's talking about castration there, he's not talking about the physical, he's talking about castrating their moral nature. How do you expect people to be good if you deny that there is goodness? Plato talked about this as well when he talked about the tyrants. He said the tyrant is to be the least admired of all men because nobody will hold him accountable. Nobody can correct him. Everybody wants to grow up. When you're in my position in life, there are very few people who are going to correct you. You better be the finished article by that point. When you're young, you're blessed with being in the position where somebody can correct you still. This is why I say never cheat on your grades, because they're worth nothing, but they will create a certain character which, when you get older, is going to bring you down. You might be able to cheat on the test, but that comes at a big price. At any rate, let's look at it one last way. This is really interesting. It's all about gaining power over nature. Let's look at some of the uses of nature and the connotations of nature. The natural is opposite of the artificial, the civil, the human, the spiritual, and the supernatural. Artificial doesn't concern us right now. If we take the rest of the list of the opposites, I think we can get to a rough idea of what men have meant by nature and what it is they oppose to her. Nature appears to be spatial and temporal, as distinct from what is less fully or so not so at all. She seems to have the world of quantity as against the world of quality, of objects as against consciousness, of the bound as against the wholly or partially autonomous, of that which knows no values against that which has both and perceives value, of efficient causes, or in some modern systems of no causality at all, as against final causes. So here's a way of seeing the artificial. It's distinct from all of those things that he just described. Now, I take it that when we understand a thing analytically and then dominate and use it for our convenience, so after we've reduced nature to be this and gain power over it, what happens then? We have to, first of all, we have to overcome a natural hesitation to do this, to see nature as something outside of ourselves, which we're going to act upon. Like nature, it's not a part of me. I will pull this back. I will act on it. Well, we have to overcome a natural resilience to that. What is it? Something has to be overcome before we can cut up a dead man or a live animal in a dissecting room. That will happen in That Hideous Strength, by the way. It's a natural revulsion over doing this. You ever done dissection in labs? Like there's a sort of squeamishness, huh? Or if you see a cut in your own hand, somebody else a cut, okay, your own, you sort of like queasy. I don't really like, and what it doesn't hurt that much, but just it's a really odd experience. These objects resist the movement of the mind whereby we thrust them into the world of mere nature. So human beings resist this. We can't just put them in the box of nature. There's a certain moral revulsion against the very idea of doing this. But in other instances, too, a similar price is exacted for our analytical knowledge and manipulative power, even if we've ceased to count it. We don't look at trees either as dryads or as beautiful objects while we cut them into beams. The first man who did so may have felt the price keenly. The bleeding trees in Virgil and Spenser may be far-off echoes of the primeval sense of impiety. What he's talking about here is the desacralization of the whole world and just treating it as material stuff. He's not going full Wordsworth, that there's God in this, but there is something to be revered in the created order. The stars lost their divinity as astronomy developed. The dying God has no place in chemical agriculture. To some, this is just the gradual discovery of the real world, but that's not the whole story. The great minds know better that there's something, that a reality has been lost. So here's his final point. The conquest of nature appears in a new light. We reduce things to mere nature in order that we may conquer them. So there's the motivation for reductionism. I talked about reductionism already, but what's the motive for it? To conquer it. Because we're not nature. We reduce our own human nature to nature to conquer ourselves. The purpose is the lust for power. We haven't looked at Tolkien yet. We're going to look at the Ring of Power. What's the purpose of the Ring of Power? Dominance. Domination over all of life. And the price of conquest is to treat a thing as mere nature. Now this word mere, he talked about in the very first book. A mere is just as a reductionist thing. It gets rid of the whole moral implications. Every conquest over nature increases her domain. So nature gets broader and broader. Everything gets more and more natural. We get rid of the supernatural at the expense of the natural. So now everything's natural. However good or bad, it's natural. But we only do that to gain power over it. Because otherwise we wouldn't do it. We'd say that's a desecration. But now nothing is sacred. So we reduce it to nature in order to gain power over it. And the effect of this is extraordinary. And I'm going to give you his final example just to conclude with a joke, because I thought I laughed out loud. He says, the stars do not become nature until we can weigh and measure them. Remember in The Silver Chair, it talks about what the star is. The soul does not become nature till we psychoanalyze her. The wresting powers from nature is also the surrendering of things to nature. As long as this process stops, short of the final stage, we may well hold that the gain outweighs the loss, but as soon as we take the the final step of reducing our own species to the level of mere nature, flatten it down. The whole process is stultified. For this time, the being who stood to gain and the being who has been sacrificed are one and the same. Dead. It's all gone. Everything human in humanity is gone. And here's the joke. This is one of the many instances where to carry a principle to what seems its logical conclusion produces absurdity. It is like the famous Irishman who found that a certain kind of stove reduced his fuel bill by half, and thence concluded that 2 stoves of the same kind would enable him to warm his house with no fuel at all. It's the magician's bargain. Give up our soul, get power in return. But once our souls, that is ourselves, have been given up, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We will be slaves and puppets of that to which we've given our souls. And that he doesn't address here in this, but in That Hideous Strength, it's demonic. That's what it is. So we think we're getting something. It's as I say, it's the magician's bargain. You give up your soul. It's the Faustus myth, Dr. Faustus. Give me your soul and I'll give you power. Okay. Do you actually ever get what you think you're getting? You do not get it. You lose everything. Anyway, that's it for now. You'll see it in the That Hideous